The laughter was the cruelest sound in Dust Devil Gulch, sharper than the grit that blew in off the plains and meaner than the midday sun. It ricocheted off the pickle barrels and sacks of flour in Jebediah's general store, a volley of ridicule aimed at Alara Vance. She stood with her shoulders drawn in, one hand resting protectively on the swell of her belly, the other holding the canvas that had earned their scorn. It was a painting of a canyon, but not a canyon any of them had ever seen. The rocks were not brown and ochre, but deep, impossible blues and purples. A river of shimmering silver, not muddy brown, cut through the landscape. And across it, spanning the chasm, was a bridge that looked like a strand of woven moonlight. To the practical, hard-bitten folk of the gulch, it was nonsensical. It was useless. It was silly. What in God's name is a body supposed to do with that, Alara? Jebediah asked, his voice thick with condescension as he wiped the counter with a greasy rag. Can't eat it. Can't wear it. Can't build with it. It's just paint and foolishness. A woman in a severe bonnet, Martha Hemlock, sniffed loudly. Wasting good canvas when she can barely afford bread. And in her condition. It's a disgrace. Alara's face burned with a heat that had nothing to do with the summer swelter. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the wooden frame. She had hoped to trade the painting for a small sack of flour and perhaps some salted pork. The hope was shriveling inside her, turning to ash. She had nothing else. Her husband, Thomas, had left for the gold fields 6 months ago with a head full of dreams and a heart full of promises, neither of which had ever returned. All she had left of him was the growing life inside her and a small trunk of pains he'd always called her whimsical nonsense. It's not supposed to be for anything, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the store's creaking floorboards. It's just how it feels. Jebediah let out a great, booming laugh. How it feels. The girl's gone simple. The door to the general store opened then, letting in a rectangle of blinding white light and a man who seemed to carry the authority of the sun itself. He was tall, dressed in a tailored city coat of dark wool that looked out of place, yet commanded respect. His face was all sharp angles and deep-set eyes, etched with the force of a man who did not ask for things but took them. This was Silas Blackwood, a name that was whispered with awe and fear across the territory. The magnate whose railroad was a crawling iron serpent changing the face of the West. He was in Dust Devil Gulch to survey the land for a new spur line, and his presence made the town feel both important and insignificant. He let the door swing shut, his gaze sweeping over the scene. He saw the smirking storekeeper, the judgmental woman, and the young, pregnant artist looking as fragile as a desert flower about to be trampled. His eyes came to rest on the painting in her hands. The laughter in the store died down, replaced by an uneasy silence. Silas Blackwood's attention was a heavy thing, and no one wanted to be on the wrong side of it. He took a slow step forward, his polished boots unervingly quiet on the dusty floor. He didn't look at Alara. He looked only at the canvas, the silver river, the impossible bridge. Jebediah, sensing a shift in the wind, cleared his throat. Just some foolishness, Mr. Blackwood. Girls got more paint than sense. Silas ignored him completely. He stopped a few feet from Alara, his expression unreadable. For a long, stretched moment, he just looked. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, traced the lines of her work with an intensity that made Alara's heart hammer against her ribs. She braced herself for a different kind of dismissal, the cold, quiet pity of a powerful man. But that's not what happened. How much? Silas Blackwood asked, his voice a low rumble. Alara blinked, confused. I was hoping for some flour. His gaze finally lifted from the canvas to her face. For the first time, she saw something other than calculation in his eyes. It was a flicker of raw, unvarnished surprise. I'm not asking what you want for it. I'm asking your price. He reached into his coat. I'll take it. They faced harsh judgment, but someone saw their true value. Before this story unfolds, tell us, have you ever stood up for someone unfairly judged? If you believe in looking beyond the surface, hit like and subscribe. The words hung in the air, solid and irrefutable. Jebediah's jaw went slack. Martha Hemlock's mouth formed a small, indignant O. Silas Blackwood, the man who bent mountains to his will, was not mocking the silly painting. He was buying it. And in that moment, the entire world of Dust Devil Gulch tilted on its axis, and Alara Vance, the pregnant, forgotten artist, found herself standing at its very center. The transaction itself was a blur of disbelief for Alara. Silas Blackwood didn't produce a few coins. He produced a billfold of heavy leather and from it extracted a $20 bill, a sum that could have fed Alara for months. He pressed it into her trembling hand, his fingers brushing hers for a brief, startling second. They were not soft, as she might have expected of a rich man, but calloused and strong. "You will find me at the hotel," he said, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "I wish to see more of your work. Bring everything you have." This evening, it was not a request. It was a command wrapped in the quiet courtesy of power. He took the painting from her, handling it with a strange reverence, and without another word to anyone else in the store, he turned and walked out. The door swung shut behind him, leaving a stunned, gaping silence in his wake. Alara stood frozen, the $20 bill feeling like a hot coal in her palm. Then, slowly, Jebediah's gaze shifted to her. The mockery was gone, replaced by a baffled, grudging respect that was almost more unnerving. "Well now," he stammered, his face flushed. "About that flower, Mrs. Vance. Top of the line, of course. And some bacon? On the house. A gift." The hypocrisy was so thick Alara could have choked on it. She looked down at the money, then at the grocer's suddenly servile face, and a spark of long-dormant fire ignited within her. She folded the bill carefully and tucked it into the pocket of her worn dress. "I'll take 2 sacks of your best flour," she said, her voice clear and steady, "and a slab of bacon. And I will pay for it." She met his eyes, letting him see that she understood the shift perfectly. She was no longer Alara, the foolish artist. She was the woman who had sold a painting to Silas Blackwood. It was a new and terrifying armor. Alara's world before that moment had been a study in diminishment. She had arrived in Dust Devil Gulch a year prior with Thomas, a man whose charm was as wide and as shallow as the dried-up creek bed at the edge of town. He saw the West as an oyster to be cracked open, and when it proved to be a stubborn, dusty rock instead, his affection for her had dried up with his prospects. The letter he'd left was short and final, leaving her with his last name and the child growing beneath her heart. She had found lodging in a small room at the back of the livery, a space that smelled perpetually of hay and horse liniment. It was all she could afford. Survival became a desperate, daily calculus. She took in mending, her fingers accustomed to the delicate dance of a paintbrush, growing raw from pushing a needle through coarse denim. It was barely enough. The townsfolk saw her as a cautionary tale, a woman abandoned, pregnant, and saddled with a useless, dreamy hobby. Her art was her only rebellion, her only sanctuary. On scraps of wood, on the back of old feed sacks, and on the few precious canvases she had left, she painted the world not as it was, but as it shimmered in the corners of her mind. Vibrant, hopeful, and alive with a logic all its own. These paintings were her prayers, her silent conversations with a universe that seemed otherwise indifferent. Silas Blackwood, by contrast, lived in a world of hard lines and cold facts. His universe was one of maps, timetables, and ledgers. He was the president of the Transcontinental Western Line, a position that made him more powerful than most governors. He saw the country as a problem of engineering and logistics. Mountains were obstacles to be tunneled, rivers were lines to be bridged, and towns like Dust Devil Gulch were dots on a map, valuable only for their proximity to water, coal, or a viable pass. He was a man of immense vision, but it was a practical vision, forged in steel and funded by investors who demanded results, not dreams. He was respected, feared, and profoundly alone, insulated from the world by the very empire he was building. He had come to Dust Devil Gulch because the schematics for the Cimarron Spur were stalled. The Granite Maw, a formidable range of mountains to the east, presented a challenge his best engineers, couldn't solve. The proposed routes were too steep, too costly, or geologically unstable. For weeks, Silas had been staring at topographical maps until the contour lines blurred into meaningless squiggles. He was a man accustomed to solutions, and the lack of one was a galling frustration. When he'd walked into that general store, he hadn't been looking for art. He'd been looking for a tin of coffee and a moment's peace from the sycophantic town council. Then he saw her painting. It was like being struck by lightning. The chaotic swirls of color and the impossible silver river were not chaos to him. He saw it instantly, an intuitive, almost prophetic rendering of the very landscape that haunted his waking hours. The bridge of woven moonlight spanned the chasm exactly where his engineers insisted it was impossible. The silver river followed a path through the purple canyons that his surveyors had completely missed. It was a map drawn by instinct, not by instruments. It was the solution. That evening, Alara presented herself at the town's only hotel. She carried her portfolio, a collection of worn canvases and painted boards tied together with twine. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She was shown up to the presidential suite, a term that meant it had 2 rooms instead of 1 and a window that didn't face a brick wall. Silas Blackwood stood by that window, looking out at the darkening plains. The painting he bought was propped on the mantelpiece, looking strangely at home. He turned as she entered, his expression serious. "Show me," he said simply. One by one, she untied the twine and laid her paintings out on the floor. There were a dozen of them, a field of wheat that glowed as if lit from within, growing in a patch of land everyone knew was barren alkali flat. A cluster of houses with roofs like overlapping sunbeams, nestled in a valley said to be plagued by flash floods. A streak of fiery orange light connecting 2 distant mesas, looking for all the world like a bolt of sunset trapped on canvas. To Alara, there were feelings given form. Loneliness, hope, a desperate yearning for beauty in a harsh land. To Silas Blackwood, there was something else entirely. He knelt, his fine wool trousers dusting the floor, and studied them with the same intensity he'd shown in the store. He wasn't looking at them as art. He was reading them. He pointed to the glowing wheat. The alkali sink 5 miles north. My agronomists claim nothing will grow there. He tapped the fiery orange streak. The sundown pass. We need to run a telegraph line, but the rock is too unstable for poles. He looked up at her, his eyes boring into hers. How do you know these things? Alara was speechless. I don't. I just paint. I see a place, and I feel what it could be. What wants to be? He was silent for a long time, his gaze moving from the paintings back to her face. He saw her worn dress, the fatigue in her eyes, the fierce, protective way her hand strayed to her abdomen. He saw the town's judgment clinging to her like dust, and he saw the astonishing, inexplicable vision that poured out of her onto the canvas. "Mrs. Vance," he said at last, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I'm not a man who believes in foolishness. I believe in assets. In your vision. It is the single greatest asset I have encountered in a decade." He paused, and a decision settled in his features, solidifying like cooling iron. "I am commissioning your services. I want you to paint this valley. Paint what you feel it wants to be. I will provide you with lodging, supplies, whatever you require." Alara felt the floor shift beneath her feet. "My services?" "Yes," he said, standing up. He looked from her to the paintings and back again. "You are no longer just an artist, Mrs. Vance. You are the chief visionary of the Cimarron Spur Line." The new arrangement was immediate and absolute. Silas Blackwood moved Alara out of the smelly room behind the livery and into the other suite in the hotel, the one adjacent to his own. He sent a wire to Cheyenne for the finest paints, brushes, and canvases money could buy. He arranged for her meals to be brought to her room, wholesome, nourishing food the likes of which she hadn't tasted in a year. The sudden shift from destitution to comfort was dizzying, a dream she was terrified of waking from. But it was not a dream. Silas was a man of his word. He treated their arrangement with the gravity of a corporate merger. Each morning, he would present her with a location. The ridge overlooking Serpent Creek, he'd say, pointing to a spot on one of his topographical maps. Or the basin where the three canyons meet. He would arrange for a buggy to take her there, with a packed lunch and a parasol to shield her from the sun. He never accompanied her. He seemed to understand, instinctively, that her process was a solitary one. Alara would spend her days sitting in the vast, silent landscape, the sun warm on her skin. At first, she was paralyzed by the pressure. How could she possibly paint a railroad? She knew nothing of such things. But Silas had been clear. "Don't paint what I want," he had told her. "Paint what you see, what you feel." And so she did. She looked at the barren basin and felt a thrum of energy deep in the earth. She painted not a dusty bowl, but a bustling hub, a town with a great, roundhouse heart where iron horses would come to rest. She painted silver lines of track curving gracefully around a hill that Silas's engineers had planned to blast through with dynamite. She painted a water tower, not where logic dictated, but where she felt the water was sweetest, drawn from a hidden spring. Her paintings were still silly by Dust Devil Gulch's standards, but now they had a purpose. They were no longer just her sanctuary. They were her work. In the evenings, she would show her days painting to Silas. He would unroll his own maps and blueprints on the large table that separated their two suites, a sort of neutral territory between their worlds. The air would be thick with the smell of turpentine and cigar smoke. He would study her canvas, then his charts, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Here," he would murmur, his finger tracing a line of vibrant green she'd painted along a dry creek bed. "My surveyors reported nothing but scree and gravel." "You've painted life." The next day, he would dispatch a team to that very spot, and more often than not, they would return, baffled, reporting a hidden seam of fertile soil or an unexpected aquifer just below the surface. A strange, quiet intimacy grew between them in those shared evenings. They rarely spoke of personal matters. Their conversation was a unique language of color and contour, of feeling and fact. He would talk of tonnage and gradients, and she would respond with descriptions of light and texture. He was fascinated by the workings of her mind, this intuitive, nonlinear way she perceived the world. It was the antithesis of his own logical, structured thinking, yet it yielded results he couldn't deny. For her part, Alara began to see the man behind the Magnate. She saw the weariness in his eyes at the end of a long day, the flicker of genuine excitement when one of her visions proved true. He treated her not as a fragile, pregnant girl, but as a colleague whose input was invaluable. For the first time since Thomas had left, she felt seen. She felt respected. The gnawing fear in her gut began to recede, replaced by a tentative, blossoming confidence. The town of Dust Devil Gulch, however, watched this peculiar partnership with a mixture of awe and venom. Their initial, fawning respect for Alara had curdled into suspicion. The whispers started in the general store and spread like a contagion. Martha Hemlock was the primary vector of this poison. "It ain't natural," she declared to anyone who would listen, her voice a sharp hiss. A powerful man like that, bewitched by a pregnant stray and her paint daubs. "She's a charlatan, I tell you." Or worse, the implication hung heavy in the air. Jebediah, bitter at having his judgment so publicly overturned, fanned the flames. "He's buying her paints, her food, her lodging. A man doesn't do that for nothing. Mark my words, there's more to this than meets the eye." The town, which had once mocked her for being useless, now resented her for her newfound, incomprehensible value. They saw her in the buggy Silas provided, and their glances were sharp with envy and contempt. They saw the deliveries of fine supplies, and they muttered about her wiles. They could not comprehend a relationship built on something as intangible as vision. They could only understand currency they could count, money and flesh. One afternoon, as Alara was returning from a day of painting out at Sundown Pass, Martha Hemlock and two other townswomen blocked her path as she tried to enter the hotel. Well, Martha sneered, her eyes raking over Alara's form, lingering on her swollen belly. "Enjoying your keep, are we? Must be nice. having a rich man pay for your every whim. Alara clutched her painting to her chest like a shield. I am working for Mr. Blackwood. It's a business arrangement. Business? One of the other women scoffed. We know what kind of business a woman like you conducts. You ought to be ashamed, using your condition to trap a man like that. The cruelty of it stole Alara's breath. They were twisting the one pure, honorable thing she had into something ugly and sordid. You don't know anything about it, she said, her voice shaking. We know you're a grifter, Martha said, stepping closer. And we know men like him get tired of their toys. When he leaves, and he will leave, you'll have nothing. And this town won't have any pity for you then. We'll run you out on a rail. The threat was real. Alara could see the cold certainty in their eyes. Her fragile confidence shattered. All the old fears came rushing back. What if they were right? What if this was all a rich man's fleeting fancy? What would happen to her child, when the railroad moved on and she was left behind in this town that hated her? She pushed past them, her eyes stinging with tears, and fled into the hotel. That night, when Silas came to review her work, he found her staring blankly at the wall, the day's painting lying untouched on the floor. What is it? He asked, his voice sharp with concern. He saw the tracks of her tears on her dusty cheeks. She couldn't bring herself to repeat the women's vile accusations. She just shook her head. What happens when the spur line is finished? She asked, her voice small. When you leave. Silas looked at her, then at the painting on the floor. It was a stunning depiction of Sundown Pass, with a line of telegraph poles that seemed to sing with energy, stretching across the mesas under a sky of impossible gold and crimson. He understood immediately. It wasn't just the work. It was her, the town. He walked over and picked up the painting. He studied it for a long moment, his back to her. This is not just about a spur line anymore, Alara, he said quietly, not turning around. I thought I was just buying a solution to an engineering problem. He finally turned to face her, his eyes dark and intense. I was wrong. He took a step closer, his presence filling the room. They think your gift is some kind of parlor trick, a temporary amusement. They are fools. They see a canvas, but I see 100 miles of track laid without a single life lost to a rock slide. They see a silly color, but I see a vein of copper that will fund a new school. What you do, it is the foundation of everything I am trying to build here. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently tap the canvas. And a foundation is not something you leave behind. His words were a bulwark against the tide of fear and doubt. But even as they comforted her, a new anxiety took root. His second in command, a man named Henderson, was due to arrive from the East Coast with members of the board. Silas had spoken of him as a man of ruthless pragmatism, a man who saw the world only in numbers and profit margins, a man who would never, ever understand a decision based on a painting of a moonbeam bridge. Henderson, Alara sensed, would be a far greater threat than the gossips in town. He was the voice of the world Silas came from, a world that had no room for visions. The arrival of Arthur Henderson and the two board members was like a cold front sweeping into Dust Devil Gulch. Henderson was a tall, severe man with a face that looked like it had been chiseled from granite and left out in the rain. His eyes, small and gray, missed nothing and approved of less. He viewed the dusty frontier town with undisguised disdain, and he viewed Alara Vance with something approaching outright hostility. He and the board members, portly, sober-suited men named Davies and Croft, were here to review the progress of the Cimarron Spur and approve the final, staggering budget for its construction. They had been summoned by Silas, but it was clear Henderson saw it as an opportunity to rein in what he considered his employer's increasingly erratic behavior. Whispers of Blackwood's pet artist had already reached the boardrooms in Philadelphia. The confrontation came sooner than Alara had feared. On the second day, Henderson, flanked by the board members and a smirking Jebediah and Martha Hemlock, who had been invited as concerned local citizens, convened a meeting in the hotel's main dining room. They had commandeered the space, turning it into an impromptu courtroom. Silas sat at the head of the long table, impassive and calm. He had insisted Alara be present. She sat by his side, feeling small and exposed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Silas," Henderson began, foregoing any pleasantries. "Let's be direct. The board has grave concerns. We are hearing reports that you have abandoned the guidance of your own engineering corps, that you have rerouted the entire line based on this." He gestured dismissively toward a stack of Alara's paintings, which Silas had insisted on bringing. "She's a fraud, is what she is." Martha Hemlock piped up from her corner, emboldened by the presence of the Easterners. "A cunning little witch who's cast a spell on him." Jebediah nodded vigorously, feeding him fantasies. "We're simple folk out here, sirs, but we know a grifter when we see 1 inch. Henderson held up a hand to silence them, though his expression indicated he agreed with their sentiment. "The point, Silas, is that we have a fiduciary duty to our investors. We are responsible for millions of dollars. We cannot and will not risk that capital on the artistic whims of a pregnant transient." The insult was delivered with surgical precision, designed to wound and disqualify. Alara flinched as if struck. She saw the flicker of triumph in Martha's eyes, the cold agreement in Henderson's. They were stripping away her value, her purpose, rendering her once again as nothing more than her unfortunate circumstances. Silas did not rise to the bait. He remained perfectly still, his gaze fixed on Henderson. For a moment, Alara thought he would unleash the legendary temper that had leveled boardrooms and broken lesser men. Instead, he did something far more unexpected. He stood up slowly and walked to the wall where his own official survey maps were pinned. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice calm and resonant, "you speak of fiduciary duty, of risk. Let me show you what real risk looks like." He unrolled one of the large topographical maps of the Granite Maw. It was covered in red ink, marking failed routes, impassable grades, and geological fault lines. "This is the work of the finest engineers in the country. This is $200,000 of wasted surveying. This is a 6-month delay that is costing this company $10,000 a day. This map represents our failure." He let the weight of that failure settle in the room. Then he picked up one of Alara's paintings, the very first one he had bought, the one with the moonbeam bridge. He pinned it to the wall right next to the map. "And this," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "is our solution." He began to point back and forth between the two, his finger a confident guide. "You see this canyon wall, Henderson? The one our chief engineer, Mr. Albright, swore was solid granite?" Alara painted it purple, a color of instability. She said, "Last week, a geological team, dispatched at my request, discovered it's mostly shale. Unstable. Had we blasted there as planned, we would have brought half the mountain down on top of the line. We would have lost dozens of men." A murmur went through the room. Croft and Davies leaned forward, their expressions shifting from skepticism to intense focus. Silas picked up another painting, the one of the glowing wheat field, the alkali sink. Albright's team said it was barren, useless. Alara painted this. She said she felt life there. We drilled. We found the largest artesian well in this territory, a water source that will not only service the railroad, but will allow for the irrigation of 10,000 acres. It has tripled the projected value of this land. He continued, one by one, laying Alara's art against the cold facts of his maps, her intuition against his engineer's calculations. He showed them the curve of track around the hill, a route that would save them a month of blasting. He showed them the valley she had painted as a town, located in the only basin naturally protected from the region's notorious winds. He was not defending her. He was presenting evidence. He was translating her poetry into the only language these men understood, the language of profit and progress. "She is not a fantasist," Silas declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "She does not see what is not there. She sees what is waiting to be uncovered. She sees the potential that lies sleeping in the earth. You call her transient, a grifter. I call her a visionary." He turned from the maps and looked directly at Henderson, his eyes blazing. "And as of this morning, Mrs. Vance is an official, salaried consultant for the Transcontinental Western Line, with a contract that stipulates her services are required for the entire duration of the project, and beyond." He let that sink in. Then he delivered the final, decisive blow. He walked back to the table and stood behind Alara's chair, his hands resting gently on her shoulders, a gesture of unwavering public protection. Furthermore, he said, his gaze sweeping over every hostile and astonished face in the room, her well-being, and that of her child, are my personal responsibility. Any threat to her is a threat to the future of this railroad, and a threat to me. Is that understood? The silence that followed was absolute. Henderson's face was a mask of disbelief. Jebediah and Martha looked as if they had been poleaxed. In that single, breathtaking speech, Silas Blackwood had not just defended Alara. He had chained his own reputation, the future of his company, and his own formidable power to her. He had taken her silly paintings and declared them to be the very cornerstone of his empire. The turning point was not a quiet shift. It was a seismic event that shook the foundations of every person in the room. The dining room, now a crucible of tension, felt small and airless. Henderson, his face pale with fury and disbelief, finally found his voice. "This is madness, Silas. You're staking a multi-million-dollar enterprise, your entire reputation, on the feelings of this woman. You cannot present this to the board in Philadelphia. They'll think you've lost your mind. We'll be a laughingstock. She's a charlatan." Martha Hemlock screeched, recovering from her shock. Her voice was shrill with the righteousness of the perpetually indignant. "It's all trickery. Ask her to explain it. Go on, ask her. She can't. It's just nonsense she daubs on a board to fool you." All eyes turned to Alara. She felt the weight of their collective gaze, a physical pressure threatening to crush her. For her entire life, her art had been a private language, a silent conversation between her soul and the canvas. To be asked to translate it, to justify its existence in the face of such raw hostility, felt like a violation. She looked at the faces around the table. Henderson's cold fury, the board members' confused anxiety, Martha's venomous sneer. Then she looked at Silas. He stood behind her, a bastion of strength, but his eyes were not commanding her to speak. They were giving her permission. They were telling her that her voice mattered. A lifetime of being dismissed, of being called foolish and silly, of hiding her truest self, coalesced into a single point of crystalline resolve. She would not be defined by their disbelief. She drew a slow, steadying breath and rose to her feet. Her hands were trembling, but her voice, when it came, was surprisingly clear. She walked not to the maps, but to her own paintings. She picked up the one in the basin, the one she had painted as a thriving town with a great roundhouse at its center. "You asked me to explain," she began, her voice quiet but carrying in the tense silence. "I cannot explain it in your words. I don't know about gradients or geological strata." She turned to face them, holding the painting so they could all see it. "But I know about loneliness. I know what it feels like for a place to be empty and waiting. When I stood in that basin, I didn't just see dust and rock. I felt a heartbeat, deep in the ground, a sense of purpose. It felt like a heart waiting for veins and arteries to connect it to the world." Her gaze moved to Henderson. "You see a town here," she said, touching the painted buildings. "I felt a community. I didn't paint houses. I painted homes. I didn't paint a station. I painted a welcome. The lines you see, the silver tracks, they aren't just metal. They're connections. They're the promise that no one has to be stranded here, alone, ever again." Her voice grew stronger, imbued with an unshakable conviction. She was no longer just defending her work. She was testifying to her faith in it. "This painting isn't a plan. It is a prayer for prosperity, yes, but also for belonging. For a future where this town isn't just a place people pass through on their way to somewhere else, but a place where they can build a life. A place where their children will be safe." Her hand went instinctively to her own belly. She looked directly at Martha Hemlock, whose face was now a mask of confusion. "You see silly colors, Mrs. Hemlock. I see hope. You see foolishness. I see a future where no woman is ever laughed at for trying to trade her only gift for a sack of flour to feed her child. The raw, unvarnished truth of her words silenced the room more effectively than any shout could have. She had not used their language of logic and numbers. She had used her own, the language of the human heart, and it was a language every person in that room, from the hardened magnate to the bitter gossip, understood on some fundamental level. Silas stepped forward then, his face etched with an emotion Alara had never seen there before, a profound, undisguised awe. He stood beside her, facing the stunned assembly. "Henderson," he said, his voice thick with feeling, "for 20 years, you and I have built an empire of iron and steel. We've measured our success in miles of track and tons of freight. But we forgot something. We forgot what we were building it for." He gestured around the room, at the town, at the vast plains outside the window. "Where she paints a river of gold," he said, his voice resonating with power, "we will lay a track of steel. Where she sees a field of suns, we will build a town. Her vision is not an alternative to our plans. It is the soul of our plans. It is the why." He paused, and his gaze softened as it came to rest on Alara. The final, crucial piece of the puzzle fell into place, not for the board, but for him. The future he had seen in her paintings was not just one of towns and tracks. It was more personal, more vital. "You all see a silly painting," he said, his voice dropping to an intimate, resonant hush that was meant only for her, yet was heard by all. "I see our future." He turned his head slightly, his eyes locking with hers. "I see my future." It was not a business declaration. It was a confession, a commitment, a truth laid bare in front of the entire world. In the ringing silence, Arthur Henderson, the man of numbers, walked slowly to the wall. He stared at the topographical map, then at Alara's impossible painting beside it. He traced the line of her moonbeam bridge with his finger, then looked at the red-inked failure on his own company's chart. For a long, agonizing moment, he was still. Then he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not agreement. It was surrender. The logic of the heart, so alien to him, had presented an argument he could not refute. The opposition didn't just crumble. It evaporated, exposed as the petty, visionless thing it was. Jebediah and Martha seemed to shrink in their chairs, their malice suddenly looking pathetic and small under the weight of the immense future that had just been declared in this room. The climax was over, and a new world had begun. The aftermath of the confrontation was a profound and ringing silence. Henderson and the board members retreated, their arguments dismantled, their worldviews shaken. Jebediah and Martha scurried away, their social power in the town shattered by their public humiliation. The dining room emptied, leaving only Silas and Alara standing in the quiet space, the air still humming with the magnitude of what had transpired. The smell of turpentine from her paintings mingled with the lingering scent of fear and victory. Without a word, Silas took her hand. His grip was firm, grounding. He led her out of the hotel and into the fading light of dusk. They walked up the small rise behind the town, the same rise where she had sometimes sat to paint, a place that overlooked the entire valley as it slumbered under a blanket of purple and rose-gold light. The sounds of the town below were muted, distant. Up here, there was only the vastness of the sky and the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. For a long time, they just stood there, side by side, watching the first stars prick the darkening canopy. The tension of the day, of the past weeks, slowly drained away, replaced by a quiet, shared relief. The battle was over. They had won. "I've spent my life building things, Alara," Silas said at last, his voice a low murmur against the evening's calm. "Railroads, companies, fortunes, all of it built on solid ground, on rock and steel and verifiable facts." He turned to look at her, his face softened by the twilight. "I never knew that the strongest foundations could be built on something as fragile and as powerful as a feeling, on a vision." Alara looked down at their joined hands. His fingers were laced through hers, a natural, easy connection. "I never knew my feelings had any value beyond my own heart," she confessed quietly. "You gave them a voice. You gave them a place in the world." "You gave me a world," he corrected her gently. "I was living in a land of maps. black and white lines on a page. You filled it with color, with life, with a future I couldn't see on my own. He paused, and the easy silence between them shifted, becoming charged with a new significance. The future he had spoken of in the hotel dining room hung in the air between them, a tangible presence. A visionary needs a place to create, he said, his voice steady and sure. A quiet place with good light. And a family needs a home. A place to be safe. To grow. He looked deep into her eyes, laying his soul bare. I believe I can provide both, if you'll let me. It wasn't a grand, poetic proposal. It was something better. It was practical. It was solid. It was a promise of shelter and stability, of shared purpose and quiet care. It was everything she had ever yearned for. Alara didn't need to answer with words. The answer was in the sudden, brilliant shining of her eyes, a reflection of the starlight above. She squeezed his hand, a silent, absolute yes. A small smile, the first truly unfettered smile he had ever seen from her, touched her lips. It was more beautiful than any sunset she could ever paint. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a simple gesture of trust and homecoming that spoke volumes. He put his arm around her, drawing her close, and together they watched the stars multiply, two solitary figures who had found their shared orbit in the vast, lonely expanse of the west. Weeks later, the valley was alive with the clang of steel on steel, the shouts of men, and the rhythmic chuff of a steam engine. The Cimarron Spur was being born, its silver lines following the gentle, intuitive curves Alara had first dreamed onto a canvas. From the porch of a new house, modest but sturdy, built on a rise overlooking the burgeoning track, Alara could see it all. The house was hers, theirs. It had a room facing north, with a large window that flooded the space with the clear, steady light she loved. She sat there now, on a rocking chair Silas had ordered from St. Louis, her body heavy and ripe with the final stages of her pregnancy. A fine, new easel stood before her, and on it rested a canvas. She was painting again, but not the sweeping, prophetic landscapes of before. Her vision had turned inward, becoming more personal, more intimate. She was painting a portrait, the likeness of a man with storm cloud eyes that held a surprising gentleness. The image of a woman, her face serene, her hand resting on the curve of her belly. And behind them, not a landscape of rock and dust, but a swirl of silver lines and a rising, golden sun. It was a painting not of what could be, but of what finally was. Silas came up the porch steps, his boots dusty from walking the line. He didn't speak, not wanting to break her concentration. He simply stood behind her, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder, right where it had been during that pivotal confrontation in the hotel. He looked not at the railroad taking shape in the valley below, his great industrial achievement, but at the image taking shape on her canvas. He watched her hand, steady and sure, as she added a final, delicate brushstroke of gold to the painted sun. And in that quiet moment, with the future of his railroad echoing in the valley and the future of his heart humming softly on the porch beside him, Silas Blackwood knew he had acquired something far more valuable than a right-of-way. He had found his destination. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. Her true worth was finally seen. What does true value in a person mean to you? Tell us below.